Thank you very much, Professor Haider. Well, you know, there have been all kinds of fascinating strands to the discussion this morning, and I'm sure we're all eagerly awaiting Professor Habib's reactions to all of these different strands, and also perhaps some assessment of how he would look at this work 50 years on. So without any further ado, may I invite Professor Habib, please.
Professor Ghosh, Professor Satish Chand, Professor Shireen Musli, Professor Farhat Hassan, Dr. Najaf Haider, ladies and gentlemen, I am very thankful to the Center of Economics, JNU, for holding this discussion on my book Agrarian System of the Mughal Empire, of Mughal India, which I consider to be a signal honor for me personally. And I therefore am most grateful to our colleagues of JNU for giving me this opportunity of speaking on certain points relating to the major thesis put forward by me in the agrarian system of Mughal India. I should first like to say that as happens to everyone who writes a book on history or any subject of history, the historiographic environment of the time exercises a considerable amount of influence. Now this book was written in the 50s, and I was appointed lecturer at the Aligarh Muslim University in 1953, exactly on the date and almost the time when Professor Satish Chandra was appointed reader in my department. His book on parties and politics at the Mughal court preceded my book. Already there was a tendency, as one could see from this book, on Professor Satish Chandra's book, to go beyond the narrative of political history, with which most of the works on medieval India had then been concerned, apart from agrarian conditions itself, where Morland had carried out a pioneer work, agrarian system of Muslim India in late 1920s. But otherwise, and then Morland's work on economic history had been answered by, or had received responses from Brij Narayan and Professor Radha Kamal Mukherjee and others. So on economic history already there had been much work, but on the political history it had almost been a generally a narrative type of history, and even when historians like Pisaran and Ibn Hassan dealt with Mughal administration, they did not set the Mughal administration in its social and economic environment. But with Professor Satish Chandra's work, there was an attempt to look beyond narrative history and find out the other problems and the internal tensions within the Mughal Empire. I was naturally influenced at that time by the nationalist school. There was an aspiration to study Indian history, whether political or economic or cultural, in the same manner as historians outside India had been studying their history. Particularly, we had at that time very close connections with British historical works, and we could see how they used charters and documents how they created statistics, how they generated statistics, what problems of economic history were worked out. One could see even from Morris Dobbs' studies in the development of capitalism, which has been cited here, how he could rely on a large amount of primary work that had been done on economic history. Obviously, we lacked that. And I should frankly confess that I had the ambition of trying to work out economic history of the Mughal period in the same way as British historians had been working out, not 16th and 17th century history on which they have so much larger and massive amount of material, but early medieval history. At least we should be able to reach that position, and that is why in my work at Oxford I had, where I prepared my thesis, I tried to go to the primary documents as far as possible, which were restricted to Persian documents. That was one failing there. In my first edition, I should confess, very little use was made of non-Persian documents. And when it was with Professor Noor Hassan and especially with Professor Satish Chand working on Rajasthan documents, that for my second edition, I was inspired to use the researches, the scholars' researches on Rajasthani documents, and then also to study Braj documents and primary Persian and Braj documents of Brajbhum, results of which were incorporated in my second edition in 1999. So clearly I was following in the footsteps of other historians, Indian historians, and this was a general process which has been, I hope, being taken forward in our historiography. Secondly, the source of influence was Marxism. I should confess that here I was first influenced greatly by my father, Professor Muhammad Habib. He was a deeply religious man and also an equally deeply skeptic. That is to say, he could say that the Arabian prophet was a revolutionary and at the same time comment adversely on God's statements in the Quran as not according with either common sense or reason. And he could say these words, therefore he was also very unpopular in circles who otherwise should have welcomed his studies in mysticism. In the 40s, he became greatly interested in Marxism and combined this curious interest both in Sufism and in Marxism at the same time. But he could write, for instance, that he had written it earlier, that Mahmud of Ghazni is always admired today by only such Muslims as have abandoned the worship of Lord Krishna for lesser gods. This did not make him popular with Muslims at all. So he could say these things, or that the Turkish sultans patronized mullahs and dancing girls with the same impartial generosity. So, and when somebody asked him why his younger son doesn't go to prayers, he said, I have decided that my elder son should be a pious Muslim and the younger son should be an agnostic, so that, you know, the winning side, whatever the winning side, one of my sons would be there. So I actually I was influenced by that, and it was partly under his influence that I joined the communist movement in 1949. And that participation in the communist movement, of course, made me come closer to Marxism. And this was my second ambition, that I would like to apply the Marxist method to Indian historiography. My supervisor at Oxford, Dr. C.C. Davies, for some reason thought that I was a mullah, and he saw all my chapters very carefully. And I think it's important that he never realized that I had any Marxist beliefs. He left the Agrarian Crisis chapter, the last chapter. He said, this is all right. He had looked very carefully. You follow my instructions as far as the style and English usage and idiom is concerned. I need not look at the last chapter. So I submitted the thesis. When he came back and read the chapter, he complained that I had shaved off my whiskers and come out as a Bolshevik leader leading the peasants against the Mughal Empire. So, what I was trying to do, I think, was to put the data first and interpret it without saying that Marx has said this, so this would be that, or using words like feudalism when one is not sure what feudalism actually means to different historians. And one reason why the word feudalism doesn't occur is this, even for British historians and French historians, feudalism has a host of meanings, and unless one defines the sense in which one uses the word feudalism, or for that reason the Asiatic mode of production, it is no use flaunting a term. It is important first to describe what the exact situation was. I, of course, thought and presented such evidence as I could give about the class structure of that time, about the internal struggles of the classes. I may be wrong, but I thought that my evidence leads to that situation, that conclusion. I did not feel that I should first state a doctrine and then try to apply it. That is why these terms are not there. Before I go further, since the developments between the first and second edition of Agrarian System, because Agrarian System, the book on Mughal Agrarian System is the main topic of consideration here. I should like to say that the agrarian system is only a partial statement. Any book has to have a defined subject. This book is restricted to the agrarian system in its economic and political framework. Culture, like religion or caste, social institutions, enter there so far as they relate directly to the agrarian system. And therefore, economic and political features dominate the work. Property rights and so on and so forth. And therefore, many other factors which influence historical process, religion is one, cultural processes, changes in the caste system, these are not considered. Sometimes referred to, but these are not considered. Essentially, the attention is on the economic relationships and political structure. With caste and caste system and so on, only considered when, or the institution of slavery only considered when they are relevant to the economic and political events directly relevant. So it doesn't have either the ambition or the purpose to explain everything. For instance, in the crisis of the Mughal Empire, the attention is always only on the rebellions. But who can deny that, for example, Nadir Shah's invasion of 1739 had a disastrous consequence for the Mughal Empire? The book assumed that this would be so, while the book highlighted rebellions and internal disturbances seen as indirect evidence of class struggles that took place before 1739 and had already weakened the empire by that time. So I agree, as Professor Satish Chand has pointed out, that the agrarian crisis of the early 18th century could also be seen as a social crisis. I totally agree. But that was not actually within the purview of my book and the agrarian system. As far as Professor Farhat Hassan's comments are concerned, I would like to say that the essential point is not to state general principles, but to study particular institutions. If those who say that the state in India was not a crucial political and economic institution should first deny that it took a very large part of the surplus produce as tax. First you deny it, and then you come to the point whether the state was important or not. So let us get down to that discussion. The trouble with Bertenstein and others are that they deal in slogans. They don't deal in fiscal and economic history. As Karashima, for instance, himself has pointed out for South India, when Vijayanagara Empire took so much of surplus produce in tax, how could you say that it is a segmentary state or segmentary sovereignty? Even when the British took over, thank you very much, thank you. You know that the tax collected in India by the preceding government and by the British state, colonial state, was treated as rent, not as a tax, because of the large amount of surplus that it occupied. Therefore, the statement that actually Indian people are untaxed because they only pay rent. The state is the landlord. This statement occurs in a famous pamphlet by John Stuart Mill, who, like his father James Mill, was an employee of the East India Company in his youth. Therefore, first you deny the tax rent equivalence by documents, by study of documents, not by declarations, and then you say that the state was important or not important. And this goes, of course, for Bertenstein and all others who have questioned the importance of the state in Mughal times, late Mughal times and colonial times. A professor at the JNU has said that colonialism was not the creation of the colonial state, as if it originated spontaneously from Indian society. Of course, colonialism could not have arisen in India unless there was a colonial state. There was colonial conquest, imposition of colonial state, colonial armed control, and then you only get tribute and the subjugation of the Indian market by colonialism. So clearly, you have to go down to facts, and I hope that that in this argument, the main question of land revenue, land tax, actual political history will be discussed, and then it should be shown that the state was not important. To Professor Utsa Patnaik's many important points, I should like to say that when I said that, actually when I said that the land prices, zamindari prices were low compared to the land revenue, they were only about double land revenue, right from around 1520 to the end of Mughal times, wherever they are found. I in fact meant to argue, I might not have made myself clear, but my main argument was that they were not taking the entire amount. Their own income was much lower than that of land revenue. Now, as far as the relationship between their income and the price of zamindari is concerned, my statement about 10 times was a guess. I thought that 10 times, at least the price should be 10 times the income. I didn't relate it mentally to the rates of interest. As far as the rates of market rates of interest are concerned, they were about 15% in Jahangir's time, but they fell in 1640s in a remarkable fall which you have all over the world in the rates of interest. In India they fell from around 15% to 12% and 10%, but that was after 1640s. I don't think that zamindars would be calculating in terms of market rates of interest. That is my feeling. Apart from income, there were also other benefits that they derived. They became important village figures. They had control over land, they had control over peasants, and they could convert them not only into income but also social prestige and so forth. So possession of zamindari would not probably be, its price would not be calculated by them in terms of the current market rates of interest. But that is my feeling. I did not intend to see a connection between the market rates of interest and the zamindari prices, although owing to English records and Dutch records, the market rates of interest have been fairly well reconstructed for the 17th century. It's also fair to say that when Agrarian system was published, at that time Binoy Chaudhary's calculations of the price as multiples of land revenue, they had not been published. They were published some 5 or 6 years later. But of course for second edition I could have used them, but they belong to a later period. As far as Professor Muswi's comments are concerned, these are arguments which we have been having with each other for quite some time, neither of one of us convincing the other. But I would like to say that when historical evidence comes up, then one has to accommodate it. And as far as the concept of village community is concerned, I did not develop a new theory. The documents spoke for themselves. And when the documents showed that the village headmen and oligarchs were important, that they were not democratic, that they controlled the amount of wasteland entirely, that they comprised a few families out of the numerous families in the village, then it became clear that you are not here speaking of a democratic unit, the village community, but you are speaking of a class structure, differentiated peasantry, in which there is a stratum, if you like, or a class of village oligarchs. And once you come to this conclusion, and then many statements like those of Milinda Panho and others, or Kama Sutra, where the village oligarchs appear to be masters of the village, then they show that actually what we thought was the village community was not a democratic institution, but a hierarchical one. And when, from that point of view, one reads about Monroe's Rayatwari system, or about the Mahalwari system in UP by British officials, then you can immediately say that they are also looking at village oligarchs not as democratic units, but as people through whom they can collect the land tax. And therefore, it appeared to me that the so-called village community as a social unit was in fact not an autonomous organization that had been decaying, but was an organization which actually was a part of the economic and political structure, not only of the Mughal Empire, but of the earlier times also. So, I did not develop the theory. The theory forced itself on me through the documents, particularly of Brajbhum, but also Nancy's Vigat and others, and also a rereading of Persian records, which forced this position on me. The question of peasant consciousness is still very important, but unfortunately in India, despite our trying so much, there is very little evidence. Perhaps here and there we begin to get that evidence. It does not tell us everything about peasant consciousness when we are thinking whether they thought themselves as a class or whether they thought themselves as a class. I will give you only one example. We tend to think that religion is a very important piece of identity and affiliation. In the Braj villages, we suddenly find a very curious phenomenon. There is let us say there is a villager known as Gobind. His son is Sammin Khan, and then his son is again a Hindu name, bears a Hindu name. And this is not one case, but 4 or 5 cases from a very limited number of documents among the village oligarchs. Without much thinking, I noted in a paper of mine on this, they are all Gaurvas. That caste seemed fixed, religion seemed fluid. The affiliation is to the caste, the religion can shift. As I say, there is no one case of shifting of religion from father to son, from Hindu to Islam, Islam back to Hinduism, and so on. But 5 or 6 cases within a very limited number of peasants' names, let us say about 40 that we have got, where the descent is also established. Now, this is not something that we were looking for or we would have assumed. We would have assumed that if a person becomes a Muslim, his caste is lost, but that is not the case. The peasants are prepared to accept him as a village or oligarch. Such a person may become head of the village, as in Radhakund. His father is a Hindu, but he becomes the head of the oligarchs. And then probably because his son becomes Hindu again, we can't trace him, he disappears. In other cases, where the parentage is given, we can see how Hindu sons of Muslims are actually taking part in some religious ceremony, Hindu's religious ceremony. So, in fact, it is the caste, Gaurva caste, which is very important. That is fixed, but religion can change. Now, we would not have, frankly, I would not have expected it. I would not also have expected Qazis to recognize a Hindu son of a Muslim father, because in Muslim law that would be murtid, but they do recognize that's probably a fact of life. Therefore, probably through these means, we can reconstruct some elements of peasant consciousness. But still it would be very limited, because peasants do not leave their writings behind. Perhaps sale deeds might tell us what language they spoke, because they are for the villagers themselves. That is, as one would expect, highly Persianized but corrupted Persianized. This is the normal language of their sales and land sales and land transfers. So we can gradually reconstruct perhaps, but not the consciousness that would tell us the slogans are not there, the demands are not there, what we get in Europe, what we get in Russia, what we get in China, as one can learn from secondary sources, they are simply not there. And one cannot therefore provide by assumption or imagination what doesn't exist. At least that is my feeling, and that therefore I didn't try to do. It may mean that they did not consider themselves as a class. As Professor Satish Chandra pointed out, the caste consciousness was far too strong, but that is possible, but one can't actually enter into a detailed discussion about it because of lack of evidence. As far as Dr. Najaf Haidar's statement was concerned, I agree with him. I had first thought, frankly, in the 1963 edition, that perhaps the price revolution also influenced India to a considerable degree, and there could be a possibility of merchant capital having increased owing to inflation in the way that it increased in Western Europe. I should add here that it's not, I disagree with Villar and others who seem to think that if you talk about price revolution and its influence on society and economy, it means that you have somehow become, you are getting away from Marxism. Actually, when one speaks of the price revolution, one should remember that its source is the excavation of silver mining in America. And the silver mining is based on enormous exploitation of the Mexican and Peruvian peoples. It is this exploitation, colonial exploitation in the grossest form, that creates the price revolution. So price revolution is not a monetary phenomenon, it's a phenomenon based on enormous exploitation. Perhaps the like of this can only be seen in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, according to an American survey, the American archaeologists went there in order to perhaps test and perhaps to disprove the Spanish accounts of enormous depopulation of Mexico owing to the dispatch of Amerindian peasants into the silver mines. Both pre-Christian and Christians, Amerindians buried their dead, so they compared the graves around 1500 with graves around 1620. And the result was astonishing. The population of 1620 was only 3% of the population of 1500 in Mexico. Only 3%, a decline of 97%. This was the basis of the silver influx and the price revolution. So actually it is wrong, even on the basis of simple Marxism, to think of price revolution as a monetary phenomenon. It originates in naked exploitation. And then then in Western Europe, as Hamilton showed, it creates extra income for the capitalists. But I should remind you that Marx in Capital also discusses this, the mining of silver in the Americas as the initial point of primitive accumulation abroad for British capital. So there at least I thought I was on firm Marxist grounds, but it turns out, partly owing to Dr. Najaf Haidar's shooting me down on the value of copper dams, which has forced me to get the book in a third edition and revise my calculations for the price changes. But otherwise also, I do not think, as he has said, I did not think, after further consideration, that the inflation in India was severe enough to give great additions to merchant capital. The pace of inflation was far too modest. Finally, I would like to make one particular point. Marxist historians have in general, particularly British and European historians, and I too, in the essay that I wrote on potentialities of capitalistic development in India, paid no attention to Marxist theory of primitive accumulation. Marx had not mentioned or even thought of primitive accumulation in the Communist Manifesto, nor in his further writings, until the publication of Capital Volume 1. Dobb unfortunately took primitive accumulation in a very limited spirit, more as creation of the proletariat than as creation of capitalist wealth. I think, and Professor Patnaik would perhaps agree with me, that creation of wealth in monetary forms is also a very important way of increasing of capital. It's not only through the creation of the proletariat. And therefore primitive accumulation has to be given its due place. When Professor Utsa Patnaik says that so much was contributed by the colonies, India and West Indies, and African slave trade and so forth, to the creation of, to the reinforcement of the Industrial Revolution in England. What is this except primitive accumulation? And as is clear in the Brenner debate, Brenner totally ignores primitive accumulation and presents a Tory form of Marx. One reason clearly why capitalism could not develop in India, apart from other reasons, is the absence of primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation has two sources. One is that you should accumulate wealth in the hands of proto-capitalist classes. Indian Jagirdars were not proto-capitalist classes. Only the merchants and master craftsmen were proto-capitalist classes. There was no primitive accumulation of wealth in their hands, which enclosure movement and colonialism secured for the English proto-capitalist classes. There are other elements also. There are other elements also which, in fact, Marx indirectly referred to. For instance, science and ideology. It could be said about Marx that on various occasions he refers to the development of science as an independent variable which helps capitalistic development. And I think it should be acknowledged that science and technology themselves have a role to play, and that they are partly at least independent variables. And therefore, it was partly this reason that, and partly of course imitating Joseph Needham, and also driven by the fact that Marx had laid so much stress on the means of production, that I began my studies on the history of technology. And the fact that there was so little of invention and diffusion in Mughal India is itself, I think, important in considering the lack of development of merchant and craftsman capital. Well, I would like to end here. I would thank you again for giving me such a patient hearing, and I should again thank the panelists for giving me so much food for thought. Thank you very much.